Look, I've been driving these highways for over 25 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. But what happened to me last month on I-40 still keeps me up at night, and not for the reasons you might think. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if I made the right choice, wondering if I'd do it again. My name's Hank, and I drive long-haul routes across the Southwest. Been doing it since my divorce back in '98, when staying on the road seemed easier than dealing with what I'd left behind at home. That day started like any other. I'd just dropped off a load of automotive parts in Amarillo, Texas, and was heading west toward Albuquerque. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky that orange-red color you only see out here in the desert. I was tired, my back was aching from sitting in the same position for hours, and I was looking forward to grabbing some coffee and maybe a burger at the next truck stop. The radio was playing some old country song, and I was just cruising along, thinking about nothing in particular. That's when I saw him at that rundown Texaco station about 40 miles outside of Amarillo. Just a guy with a backpack, thumb out, looking like he'd been standing there for hours. Now, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, company policy and all that, but something about this guy made me slow down. Maybe it was the way he wasn't desperately waving at every car that passed. Or maybe it was because he reminded me of my son Jake, who I hadn't seen in 3 years. I pulled over and he jogged up to the passenger side. When he got close enough, I could see he was probably in his early 40s, with graying hair and these deep-set eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. His clothes were clean but worn, and he carried himself with this quiet dignity that you don't see much anymore. He knocked on the window and I rolled it down. "Hey there," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "I'm Daryl. I'm heading to Albuquerque if you're going that way. I can pitch in for gas money." There was something about the way he said it. No desperation, no sob story, just a straightforward request. But then he added something that made my stomach drop. "I should probably tell you up front, I just got out of federal prison yesterday. Did 8 years for armed robbery. I understand if you don't want to take the risk." My first instinct was to say no and drive off. Every sensible part of my brain was screaming at me to put the truck in gear and get out of there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the honesty. Most people would have lied or just not mentioned it at all. Or maybe it was because he didn't look like the dangerous criminals you see on TV. He just looked tired, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy load for a long time and was ready to set it down. I sat there for what felt like forever, engine idling, weighing my options. Finally, I unlocked the door and said, "Get in, but we're going to have some ground rules." Cool. He climbed into the cab, and I could smell the cheap soap from whatever facility he'd been staying at, mixed with the scent of someone who'd been traveling hard. Daryl settled into the passenger seat carefully, like he was afraid of taking up too much space or making me uncomfortable. He put his backpack on the floor between his feet. It was one of those army surplus ones, faded green and patched in a couple places. "I appreciate this more than you know," he said, buckling his seatbelt. "Haven't been in a vehicle that wasn't a prison transport in 8 years." I pulled back onto the highway and laid out my rules. No sudden movements. Keep your hands where I can see them, and if you need to reach for anything, ask first. He nodded at each one without complaint. "Fair enough," he said. "Mind if I ask what you're hauling?" I told him about the run to Albuquerque. Just some construction equipment for a job site outside the city. Nothing valuable, nothing worth stealing. But as soon as I said it, I wondered if I should have kept my mouth shut. The first hour passed in mostly silence. I kept glancing over at him, looking for signs of trouble, but he just stared out the window at the desert landscape rolling by. His hands stayed folded in his lap, and every time I shifted gears or adjusted the mirrors, he'd glance my way like he was making sure I was okay. It struck me how backward that was. Here I was, the free man, and he was the one checking on me. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere past the Texas-New Mexico border, Daryl finally started talking. Not about prison or his crimes, but about small things. How different the landscape looked after 8 years. How much technology had changed. How weird it felt to see wind farms where there used to be nothing but scrubland. His voice was calm, measured, like someone who'd had a lot of time to think about things. You know, he said, watching a hawk circle overhead. I used to drive this route with my dad when I was a kid. He was a trucker too, back in the 80s. Different world then. I found myself relaxing a little, though I kept my guard up. There was something about the way he talked that reminded me of the old-timers I'd met over the years. Guys who'd been around the block and learned to appreciate simple things. What happened to your dad? I asked, surprising myself by engaging in conversation. Cancer got him when I was 19, Daryl said matter-of-factly. That's when everything started going sideways for me. Started drinking too much, making bad decisions, hanging around with the wrong crowd. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was pointing a gun at a convenience store clerk over $200 and a carton of cigarettes. He paused, shaking his head. Stupidest thing I ever did in my life. That clerk was probably somebody's dad, somebody's husband. I think about that a lot. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Most people would have made excuses or tried to justify it somehow, but Daryl just owned it. As we drove deeper into New Mexico, the conversation kept flowing in ways I hadn't expected. Daryl told me about his brother Marcus, who lived in Albuquerque, and had finally agreed to let him stay while he got back on his feet. We haven't talked in probably 6 years, he said, staring out at the darkening sky. He wrote me off when I got sentenced, said I was a lost cause. Can't say I blamed him. I'd pretty much written myself off too. But last month, out of nowhere, he sent me a letter. Said he'd been thinking about family, about second chances. Said if I was serious about changing, he'd help me get started. There was something in his voice when he talked about his brother, a mixture of hope and fear that I recognized. It reminded me of how I felt every time I thought about calling my son Jake, wondering if this would be the time he'd actually answer, or if he'd just let it go to voicemail again. What's the plan once you get there? I asked. Daryl pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. It looked like it had been read and reread a dozen times. Marcus knows a guy who runs a landscaping business. Says he might have work for someone who's not afraid of hard labor. It's not much, but it's honest work, and that's more than I've had in a long time. He refolded the paper carefully and put it back in his pocket. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm actually excited about mowing lawns and planting flowers. 8 years of concrete and steel bars makes you appreciate the idea of working with your hands in the dirt. You know, the sun had completely disappeared by the time we reached that truck stop near the New Mexico border. It was one of those places that looks like it's been forgotten by time. A few diesel pumps, a small convenience store with flickering neon signs, and a parking area that was mostly empty except for a couple of other big rigs. I was running low on fuel and needed to grab some coffee and maybe a sandwich. You hungry? I asked Daryl as I pulled up to the pumps. I've got some cash if you want to grab something from inside. He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to offer. I appreciate that, but I'm okay. Got some crackers and peanut butter in my bag. I shook my head. When's the last time you had a real meal? He thought about it for a moment. Tuesday, I think. They gave us a send-off breakfast at the halfway house. That was 3 days ago. Come on, I said, shutting off the engine. Let's get you some real food. My treat. As we walked toward the store, I noticed how Daryl kept scanning the area, his eyes moving constantly. It wasn't paranoid behavior exactly, more like someone who'd learned to always be aware of his surroundings. Habit, he said, noticing me watching him. You learn to pay attention to everything in prison. Who's where, who's doing what, who doesn't belong. Keeps you alive. Inside the store, he ordered a turkey sandwich and a cup of coffee, thanking me repeatedly. The clerk, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, kept staring at us with suspicious eyes. I wondered if he could somehow tell that Daryl was an ex-con, or if he was just being paranoid about 2 strangers stopping by so late at night. We sat outside at one of those plastic picnic tables next to the store, eating our sandwiches under the buzzing fluorescent lights. The desert air was cool now, and you could hear coyotes howling somewhere out in the darkness. Daryl ate slowly, like he was savoring every bite. You know, he said between bites, I never realized how much I missed simple things like this. Choosing what to eat, when to eat it, where to sit. In prison, Everything's scheduled. Everything's controlled. You eat what they give you. When they tell you to eat it, sitting where they tell you to sit." He paused, looking out at the empty highway. "First night I was out, I spent 20 minutes just standing in the grocery store cereal aisle. All those choices, all those colors and flavors. I almost started crying right there next to the Cheerios. I found myself really listening to him, not just waiting for my turn to talk or looking for warning signs. There was something genuine about the way he spoke, like he'd spent years thinking about these moments and what they meant." "What was the hardest part?" I asked. "The isolation," he said without hesitation. "Not just being away from people, but being away from normal human interaction. In prison, every conversation has an agenda. Every relationship is about survival or advantage. You forget how to just talk to someone without calculating what they want from you or what you need from them." He gestured to the space between us. "This right here, just two people sharing a meal and talking. I'd forgotten how good this feels." As we finished eating, I told him about my son, Jake. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way he'd been so honest with me, or maybe it was just being out there in the middle of nowhere with a stranger who had no reason to judge me. "He got into drugs when he was 17, I said, wrapping up the plastic from my sandwich. "Started with pills, then moved on to harder stuff. I tried everything, rehab, tough love, enabling, you name it. Nothing worked. Last time I saw him, he was stealing from his own mother to buy his next fix." Darryl nodded slowly, like he understood. "I blame myself for a long time," I continued. "Thought if I'd been around more, if I hadn't been on the road so much, maybe things would have been different. But you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Where is he now?" Darryl asked quietly. "I don't know," I admitted. "Last I heard, he was living on the streets in Phoenix. That was 3 years ago." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. Then Darryl said something that stuck with me. "You know what I learned inside? Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just be ready when they're ready. You can't force someone to change, but you can be there when they decide they want to." I looked at him, this man who'd spent 8 years behind bars, and realized he might understand something about redemption that I'd never considered. Maybe Jake wasn't a lost cause. Maybe none of us were. We were getting ready to head back to the truck when I noticed a car pulled up near the far end of the parking lot. It was an old sedan, maybe a 90s Honda, with its lights off, even though it was pretty dark out there. Something about it felt wrong, the way it was positioned, almost hidden behind the dumpster, like whoever was inside didn't want to be seen. I mentioned it to Darryl, and he glanced over casually, not turning his head too much. "Yeah, I saw them pull up about 10 minutes ago," he said quietly. "Two guys in the front seat. They've been sitting there watching us since we came outside." My heart started beating a little faster. "You think they're waiting for us?" I asked. Darryl was quiet for a moment, studying the car without being obvious about it. "Could be coincidence," he said, but his voice had changed. It was more alert now, more focused. "But in my experience, when someone parks in the shadows at a truck stop this late at night, they're not just taking a break." I started thinking about all the stories I'd heard over the years. Truckers getting robbed, hijacked, worse. Most of the time, it happened at places just like this. Isolated stops in the middle of nowhere, where help was miles away and screaming wouldn't do any good. "What do you think we should do?" I asked. Darryl stood up slowly, stretching like he was just working out the kinks from sitting. "Let's head back to the truck like everything's normal. Keep talking, keep it casual. If they're planning something, they'll make their move when we're in the open." And we started walking back toward my rig, and I could feel eyes on us from that car. My palms were sweating, and I was trying to remember where I'd left my tire iron. Was it in the cab or in the toolbox mounted behind the sleeper? Darryl walked beside me, his pace steady and unhurried, but I could tell he was coiled like a spring. "When we get to the truck," he said in a low voice, "I want you to go around to the driver's side and get in. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. If something happens, you start that engine and get out of here." "What about you?" I asked. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I can take care of myself." We were maybe 20 feet from the truck when I heard car doors slamming behind us. I wanted to turn around, wanted to see what was happening, but Daryl's hand touched my arm gently. "Keep walking," he said. "Almost there." But we weren't going to make it. I could hear footsteps behind us, moving fast, and then a voice shouted, "Hey, stop right there!" My blood turned to ice. This was really happening. After 25 years of driving these roads, I was about to become one of those stories that other truckers tell at truck stops, if I lived to tell it at all. "Turn around slow," the voice commanded. "Keep your hands where we can see them." I started to turn, and that's when I saw them. Two guys in dark clothes, both wearing ski masks, both holding what looked like pistols. The bigger one was pointing his gun at me, while the smaller one had his weapon trained on Daryl. "This is how it's gonna work," the big one said. "You're gonna give us the keys to that truck, empty your wallets, and then you're gonna lie face down on the ground while we decide what to do with you." My hands were shaking as I reached for my wallet, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The smaller guy with the gun kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, and I could tell he was nervous, which made him more dangerous. "Come on, move faster," the big one barked. "We ain't got all night." I fumbled with my wallet, my fingers not working right, when I heard Daryl's voice, calm and steady. "Easy, fellas. Nobody needs to get hurt here." The big guy swung his gun toward Daryl. "Shut up, old man. We're not looking for conversation." But Daryl kept talking, his voice almost conversational. "I get it. You need money. You see an opportunity. But think about this for a minute. You're about to rob a trucker and an ex-con at a truck stop where there's probably security cameras. That's federal charges, automatic 10 years minimum." The smaller guy's gun wavered slightly. "How do you know he's an ex-con?" he asked his partner. "Because I am one," Daryl said simply. "Just got out 3 days ago, spent 8 years in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, and I'm telling you boys, this is not the score you want." Something in his voice made both of them hesitate. He wasn't threatening them or trying to be tough. He was just stating facts like he was discussing the weather. "You see," Daryl continued, "I made the same mistake you're about to make. Thought I could take a shortcut, make some easy money. Ended up losing 8 years of my life, my family, my freedom, all for $200 and a carton of cigarettes." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could see the two guys looking at each other, uncertainty creeping into their body language. But the big one wasn't backing down. "Nice story, Grandpa, but we're not here for life lessons," he snarled. "Keys and wallets now, or somebody's gonna get shot." That's when everything went sideways. The smaller guy's gun was pointed at Daryl, but his attention was on his partner, and Daryl must have seen his chance. In one fluid motion that was so fast I almost missed it, Daryl stepped forward and to the side, grabbed the smaller guy's wrist with both hands, and twisted. The gun went off with a deafening crack that echoed across the empty parking lot, but the bullet went wide, shattering the window of an abandoned car nearby. The guy screamed as Daryl continued the motion, using the attacker's own momentum to flip him onto his back on the asphalt. The gun went skittering across the pavement, and suddenly there was only one armed man left. But the big guy was already turning his weapon toward Daryl, and I could see murder in his eyes. Without thinking, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a piece of concrete from the broken curb, and hurled it at the gunman's head. It caught him in the shoulder, throwing off his aim just enough that when he pulled the trigger, the bullet went high. Daryl didn't waste the opportunity. He rolled away from the guy on the ground and came up running, closing the distance between himself and the big guy before the man could get off another shot. What happened next was over in seconds, but it felt like slow motion. Daryl hit the big guy low and hard, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection like a linebacker making a tackle. They both went down, rolling across the gravel and broken glass, fighting for control of the gun. I could hear them grunting and cursing, the sound of fists hitting flesh, the scrape of boots on asphalt. The smaller guy was trying to get back on his feet, blood streaming from his nose where it had hit the pavement, but he was moving slow and unsteady. I knew I had to do something, but I felt frozen, like my brain couldn't process what was happening fast enough to make my body move. Then I heard the gun go off again, and my heart stopped. For a terrible moment, everything went quiet except for the ringing in my ears. I saw Daryl and the big guy separate, both of them breathing hard, and I couldn't tell who was hurt. Then the big guy dropped the gun and clutched his leg, cursing a blue streak. "You shot me!" he yelled, like he couldn't believe it. "You actually shot me!" Daryl kicked the gun away and stepped back, his hands up. "You shot yourself, genius," he said, breathing hard. "I was trying to keep you from pulling the trigger, and you did it anyway." The smaller guy was stumbling toward us, probably thinking he could still salvage the situation, but Daryl turned to face him. "Stay right there," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made the guy stop in his tracks. "Your partner needs medical attention, and you need to think real hard about whether you want to make this worse than it already is." The next few minutes were chaos. The big guy was rolling around on the ground, holding his leg and moaning about how he was going to bleed to death. The smaller guy kept looking between his partner, Daryl, and me, like he was trying to decide whether to run or fight or surrender. I was standing there with my hands shaking, still holding that piece of concrete, wondering if I should call 911 or if these guys had friends coming. "Get some towels from your truck," Daryl told me, his voice steady despite everything that had just happened. "We need to stop the bleeding." I ran to my cab and grabbed the first aid kit and some clean shop rags, my hands fumbling with the latches. When I got back, Daryl was kneeling next to the wounded man, pressing his jacket against the leg wound. "It's not as bad as it looks," he was saying. "Bullet went clean through the muscle, missed the bone and the major arteries. You'll live, but you need to get to a hospital." The smaller guy was just standing there, looking lost. "What are we supposed to do now?" he asked, nobody in particular. "Now you call 911, Daryl said without looking up. "You tell them there's been a shooting, someone needs an ambulance, and you take responsibility for what happened here. Maybe the judge will go easier on you if you do the right thing." I pulled out my phone and dialed, my voice shaking as I gave the dispatcher our location. The whole time, I kept thinking about how fast everything had changed. 10 minutes ago, we were just two guys eating sandwiches and talking about our kids. Now, there was blood on the asphalt and sirens in the distance. The police arrived first. 3 squad cars with their red and blue lights painting the whole truck stop in crazy colors. Then came the ambulance, followed by more cops, and pretty soon the place looked like a crime scene from a TV show. I found myself sitting in the back of a patrol car, not under arrest, but giving my statement to a detective who looked like he'd been pulled out of bed for this. His name was Martinez, and he had that tired, seen-it-all expression that cops get after dealing with too much human stupidity. "So let me get this straight," he said, flipping through his notepad. "You picked up a hitchhiker who just got out of federal prison, and when you got robbed, he's the one who saved your life." I nodded, watching through the window as paramedics loaded the wounded gunman into the ambulance. "I know how it sounds," I said, "but that's exactly what happened. If Daryl hadn't been there, I'd probably be dead right now." The detective looked skeptical. "And you're sure this wasn't some kind of setup? Ex-con flags down a truck driver, leads him to a remote location where his buddies are waiting?" The thought had crossed my mind, but I shook my head. "No way. You should have seen his face when those guys showed up. He was as surprised as I was, and he didn't have to step in. He could have just let them rob me and walk away clean." Martinez made some notes, and then looked at me seriously. "You know you're lucky to be alive, right? These weren't kids playing around. Both of them had prior arrests for armed robbery, and the big one just got out of state prison 6 months ago." While I was giving my statement, I could see Daryl talking to another detective about 50 feet away. He was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, holding an ice pack to his knuckles, answering questions in that same calm, measured way he'd been talking all evening. Every now and then, he'd look over at me, and I could see the concern in his eyes, not for himself, but for me. It struck me as backwards, considering he was the one who'd just fought off 2 armed men, while I stood there like a deer in headlights. "What's gonna happen to him?" I asked Martinez. "To your friend?" "Nothing, as far as I can tell. He was defending himself and you. Probably saved both your lives." The detective paused, looking at his notes. Though, I gotta say, it's unusual. Most ex-cons try to avoid situations like this, keep their heads down, stay out of trouble. Your buddy could have just handed over his wallet and walked away. "He's not really my friend," I said, then immediately felt bad about it. "I mean, I just met him today, but he's a good man." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Guy's got a record for armed robbery, same as the men who tried to rob you tonight." I thought about that for a moment, watching Daryl through the window. He was demonstrating something to the detective, showing how he disarmed the first gunman, his movements careful and precise. "Yeah," I said finally, "I'm sure. Sometimes people change. Sometimes they get a second chance and actually do something with it." It was almost 3 in the morning by the time the cops finished with us. The wounded gunman was at the hospital under guard, his partner was in custody, and the crime scene tape was finally coming down. I was exhausted, running on adrenaline and truck stop coffee, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Daryl walked over to where I was standing next to my rig, and I could see he was beat up pretty good. Scraped knuckles, a cut on his cheek, and he was moving like his ribs hurt. "You okay?" he asked, which made me almost laugh. Here he was, the guy who'd just fought off 2 armed robbers, asking if I was okay. "I should be asking you that," I said. "You're the one who got in a fight." He shrugged it off. "I've been in worse scrapes. How about you? You looked pretty shaken up back there." I was quiet for a moment, trying to process everything. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there," I said. "Those guys weren't playing around. They would have shot me and taken the truck, and nobody would have found my body until morning." Daryl nodded slowly. "Maybe, but that's not what happened. That's the thing about life. It's not about what might have been. It's about what is." He looked out at the empty highway, where the occasional car would pass by, the drivers probably having no idea what had just gone down at this little truck stop. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. 8 years ago, I was on the other side of this. I was the guy with the gun, terrorizing some poor clerk who was just trying to make it through his shift. Tonight, I got to be the guy who stopped it from happening to someone else. We got back on the road around 4 in the morning, both of us too wired to sleep despite being exhausted. The police had released the truck after checking it over, and Detective Martinez had given us his card in case we remembered anything else. "Call me if you have any problems," he'd said to Daryl. "What you did tonight, that took guts. Not many people would have stepped up like that." As we drove through the pre-dawn darkness, I kept glancing over at Daryl. He was staring out the window at the desert landscape, lost in thought. The radio was playing some old Willie Nelson song, and the rhythm of the road was starting to calm my nerves. "Can I ask you something?" I said after we'd been driving for about an hour. "Sure," he replied. "Why did you do it? You could have just stood there, let them rob me, and walked away clean. Nobody would have blamed you." Daryl was quiet for a long time, and I thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "You know what I thought about when I saw those guns? I thought about that convenience store clerk from 8 years ago. Kid couldn't have been more than 20, working the night shift to pay for college. I still remember the look in his eyes when I pointed that gun at him. Pure terror. He thought he was going to die because of me." He paused, his voice getting quieter. "I swore to myself that if I ever got out of prison, if I ever had the chance to be on the other side of that equation, I'd do whatever it took to make sure nobody else had to feel that fear. Tonight was my chance to keep that promise." We reached Albuquerque just as the sun was coming up, painting the Sandia Mountains in shades of pink and gold. I'd been driving these routes for years, but I'd never really noticed how beautiful the sunrise could be until that morning. Maybe it was because I'd come so close to never seeing another one. Daryl had been quiet for the last hour, and I could tell he was getting nervous about seeing his brother. "You want me to drop you at his house?" I asked as we came into the city. "If you don't mind, could you just take me to that Denny's over there?" He pointed to a restaurant near the interstate. "I want to call Marcus first. Let him know I'm here. Don't want to just show up on his doorstep after 8 years." I pulled into the parking lot and shut off the engine. We sat there for a moment, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. "I don't know how to thank you," I said finally. "You saved my life back there." Daryl shook his head. "You saved mine too, you know. When you stopped to pick me up, when you gave me a chance, that meant more to me than you'll ever know. Most people would have driven right past." He grabbed his worn backpack from the floor and opened the door. "Take care of yourself, Hank, and maybe give your son a call sometime. You never know, he might be ready to hear from you." I watched him walk toward the restaurant, this man who'd gone from armed robber to hero in the span of 8 years. Part of me wanted to follow him inside to make sure his brother actually showed up, but I knew he needed to handle this part on his own. It's been 3 months since that night, and I still think about it almost every day. I kept Detective Martinez's card, and about a month later, I called him to ask how the case was going. The 2 gunmen had pleaded guilty. The wounded one got 12 years, his partner got 8. Martinez told me that Daryl's testimony had been crucial in getting them to take the plea deal. "Your friend's got a future in law enforcement, if he wants it," the detective had said. "We could use more people like him." I never saw Daryl again after that morning in Albuquerque, but I did get a letter from him about 6 weeks later. He'd gotten the landscaping job his brother had lined up, and he was renting a small apartment near the shop where he worked. "I think about that night a lot," he wrote. "Not the scary parts, but the conversation we had over those sandwiches. You listening to my story, me listening to yours. That's when I knew I was really free, when I could sit with another person and just be human again." At the bottom of the letter, he'd written something that I've carried with me ever since. "You took a chance on me when nobody else would. I hope someday you'll take the same chance on your son." I kept that letter in my wallet, and 2 weeks ago, I finally worked up the courage to call Jake. He didn't answer, but he didn't hang up on me either. It went to voicemail. I left a message, told him I loved him, and that I'd be ready to talk whenever he was. Maybe nothing will come of it, but Daryl was right about one thing. Sometimes the best you can do is just be ready when someone else is ready to change.